Rachel was already halfway through her nighttime routine when she turned the TV on, just for background noise. She wasn't paying attention. Not until his face appeared on the local news, standing beside a battered, paint-chipped food truck. She almost laughed. Marcus. Of course he'd end up on television like this. Broke, desperate, probably begging the city for sympathy. But then the anchor's voice cut through the room, clear and certain. The man on screen had just become the owner of the fastest-growing restaurant chain in the state. Rachel went completely still. To understand how Marcus Hale ended up on that television screen, you have to go back to the version of him that most people never bothered to look at twice. He wasn't the kind of man who took up space in a room. He didn't have the loud confidence of someone who expected things to go his way. He was steady, quiet, the type who showed up early and left late, and never made a point of letting anyone know. For years, he ran the back kitchen of a mid-sized restaurant called Carver's Grill, not as the head chef, but as the kitchen manager, the person who kept everything moving without ever getting credit for it. He knew every supplier's schedule, every line cook's bad habit, every shortcut that would ruin a dish, and every one that wouldn't. The place ran because of him, and almost no one who ate there ever knew his name. His marriage to Rachel had lasted 7 years. From the outside, it probably looked like a reasonable life, a house in a quiet neighborhood, 2 incomes, a routine that held. But somewhere along the way, the distance between them stopped being temporary. Rachel was ambitious in a way that made Marcus feel like a placeholder. She moved through the world with a sharp, forward-leaning energy, always angling toward the next thing, always measuring. Marcus cooked. Marcus fixed things. Marcus stayed. And eventually staying wasn't enough. When Rachel filed for divorce, Marcus didn't fight it the way he probably should have. He didn't have the money for a skilled attorney. And more than that, he didn't have the stomach for a prolonged war. He signed what he was told to sign. The house went to Rachel. The car went to Rachel. The savings account, built from years of double shifts and skipped vacations, was divided in a way that left Marcus with just enough to feel the loss, but not enough to start over clean. He walked out of the courthouse with a duffel bag and a number in his head, the total of what remained after everything was settled. It wasn't a number that inspired confidence. He moved into a room in a shared apartment on the east side of the city. The room was small enough that he could touch both walls if he stretched his arms. There was a window that faced the side of another building, and the radiator clicked all night in winter. Marcus paid his rent on time every month and told himself it was temporary. He worked delivery shifts in the evenings, picking up orders from restaurants that probably used to be competitors of Carver's Grill, hauling bags of food to apartment buildings and handing them to people who barely looked at him. During the day, he picked up prep work at a breakfast diner, 2 neighborhoods over, chopping vegetables, breaking down boxes, doing whatever needed to be done before the morning rush. He was good at both jobs. Neither one was going anywhere. There were nights when he sat at the small desk in his room and tried to think clearly about what came next. He had skills. He had more than a decade of kitchen experience. He knew food in a way that most people who cooked for a living didn't, not just technique, but instinct. He knew what made people want to come back. But knowing something and being able to do something about it were 2 different problems, and right now, the gap between them felt permanent. Still, he held on to a belief that felt almost stubborn by that point, that hard work eventually mattered. That if he kept moving, kept showing up, something would shift. He couldn't have told you where that belief came from. He just hadn't found a reason strong enough to let it go. Then Carver's Grill closed. It wasn't a surprise, not entirely. The owner had been borrowing against the business for 2 years, and the suppliers were getting slower and slower to deliver because the invoices weren't being paid on time. Marcus had seen the signs. But seeing them coming didn't make it any easier when the owner called him on a Tuesday morning and told him not to bother coming in. The restaurant was done. The doors were locked. Whatever Marcus had saved from the kitchen manager salary, a few $100s spread across 2 bank accounts, was now the whole of his financial world. He counted it twice. $300. That was what he had. He spent the first day after the firing in his room, sitting on the edge of the bed, running numbers in his head that never added up to anything useful. He could stretch $300 for maybe 3 weeks. If he was careful, rent was already overdue. The delivery job had dried up after his hours got cut the previous month, and the diner wasn't going to take him back full-time on short notice. He had a phone, a change of clothes, and a set of kitchen knives he'd bought years ago and carried everywhere. Nothing else that counted for much. On the second day, he walked. He didn't have a destination. He just needed to move to do something with his body, while his mind sorted through the mess. He ended up in a part of the city he didn't usually pass, through a stretch of commercial blocks near an auto repair garage, the kind of neighborhood that had been halfway through a renovation for about a decade and never quite finished. That was where he saw the truck. It was parked behind the garage, half hidden behind a chain-link fence. A food truck, or what used to be one, an older model, maybe 15 years old, with a serving window on the side that had been bolted shut, and paint so faded that the original color was hard to determine. One of the back tires was flat. The exhaust vent on the roof was bent sideways. Someone had written the word "dead" in marker on the rear bumper, which Marcus thought was either honest or funny, maybe both. He stood looking at it for a while. The garage owner came out to see what he was looking at. His name was Terry, a heavy-set man in his 50s, with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. Terry told Marcus the truck had been left there by a catering company that went under about 2 years ago and never came back to claim it. He'd been meaning to have it towed to a scrapyard but kept putting it off. If someone wanted it, he'd take $300 just to get it off his property. Marcus knew what $300 meant. It was everything. Spending it on a broken-down truck with a flat tire and a dead engine was not a rational decision. There was no argument he could make to himself that added up to a good idea. And yet he stood there, looking at that truck, for a long time, thinking about the delivery shifts that were going nowhere, and the prep job that had disappeared, and the room with the 2 walls he could touch from the center. He thought about Rachel signing documents with a pen that cost more than his weekly grocery budget. He thought about what it felt like to build something for 7 years and walk away with a duffel bag. He asked Terry if he could look inside. The interior was rough. The grill was coated in old grease that had hardened into a dark crust. One of the burner knobs was missing. The refrigeration unit in the back made a sound when Marcus pressed the power switch that suggested it hadn't worked in some time. The floor had a soft spot near the back corner that gave slightly under his weight. It was objectively a disaster. But the bones were there. The layout was right. The ventilation hood was intact. The serving window could be unbolted and functional again with the right tools. Marcus had spent a decade in kitchens. He knew what could be saved and what couldn't. This could be saved. It would take work and time and more money than he currently had, but the structure was sound. He told Terry he'd take it. Terry looked at him the way people look at someone who has just said something they're not sure they heard correctly. He asked Marcus if he understood that the truck didn't run, that the refrigeration was shot, that the tires needed replacing. Marcus said he understood. Terry shrugged, took the $300, and handed him a title that had been sitting in his desk drawer for 2 years. Marcus pushed the truck by hand, with Terry's reluctant help, to a spot along the curb outside the garage where he could work on it. He had no tools beyond what he could borrow from Terry's garage, and no money left. What he had was time, knowledge, and the particular kind of focus that comes when there is genuinely nothing left to fall back on. He cleaned the grill that first night until his arms ached, scraping years of buildup off the cooking surface by hand. He found a guy 3 blocks over who sold used auto parts and negotiated a payment plan for a replacement battery and a used alternator. He borrowed a tire iron and fixed the flat with a spare he found behind the garage. Every problem he hit, he found a way around it that cost as little as possible. It was slow, it was unglamorous, and it was, for the first time in a long while, entirely his. The people who knew him, a handful of former co-workers, the couple he rented from, thought it was a bad idea. Not meanly, mostly just honestly. One of the guys from the diner told him straight, You can't build a food business from a broken truck with no capital and no location. Marcus didn't argue. He just kept working. Rachel heard about it through someone the way small city gossip always finds a way. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that Marcus was fixing up some old truck parked near a garage on the east side. She didn't seek out the information, but when it reached her, she filed it away with a kind of tired certainty. She had expected him to land somewhere like this, a man who spent his best years managing other people's kitchens, and then lost everything in a divorce he didn't even have the energy to fight. Of course, he ended up trying to make something out of scrap metal. It confirmed what she'd believed for years, that Marcus was someone who tried hard and arrived nowhere. The truck was just the latest version of that story. Marcus didn't know what Rachel thought. He wasn't thinking about Rachel. He was thinking about the burner that kept cutting out, and the permit office downtown that had a line around the block every morning. He was thinking about whether the refrigeration unit could be fixed, or whether he needed to replace it entirely, and whether he could get it open by the end of the month. He was thinking about the menu, not something elaborate, not something that tried too hard, but something honest. Food he actually believed in. He had an idea for a burger that he'd been turning over in his head for years, something with a specific balance of acid and fat and texture that he'd never been able to put on a menu at Carver's because the owner wanted safe, predictable, middle-of-the-road comfort food. Now there was no owner. There was only him. He worked on the truck every day for 3 weeks. By the end of it, the engine turned over on the first try. The grill held heat evenly. The serving window opened and closed without catching. The refrigeration unit ran cold and steady. He painted the exterior himself a flat charcoal gray, nothing flashy because he ran out of paint halfway through and couldn't afford more. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked. He stood back and looked at it. The night before, he planned to open for the first time. It was late, and the street was quiet, and the truck sat under a single street light, looking like exactly what it was, a patched-together second-hand, almost there thing that had no business existing. Marcus looked at it for a long time. He had $300 once, and now he had $0. He had a truck that technically ran a menu he believed in, and no guarantee that a single person would stop to buy anything from him. He had been wrong about things before. He had trusted the wrong situations, stayed too long in the wrong places, and ended up with less than he started. Maybe this was another version of that. Maybe Terry had been right to look at him like he was making a mistake. But the grill was clean, the burners were lit, and in the morning he was going to find out. The first morning Marcus opened the serving window, 3 people walked past without looking up. A 4th stopped, studied the menu board he'd written in marker on a piece of cardboard, and asked how much for the burger. Marcus told him. The man nodded, ordered one, and ate it standing at the curb. He didn't say anything when he finished. He just folded the wrapper, dropped it in the trash can nearby, and walked away. Marcus didn't know what to make of that. He told himself it was a start. The first week was rough in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The truck's engine ran fine, but the transmission made a sound, when he shifted into reverse, that suggested something expensive was waiting to go wrong. He'd parked on a block near a small office complex, figuring the lunch crowd would be reliable. But the permit he'd pulled didn't cover that specific zone, and a city inspector cited him on the 3rd day. The fine wasn't large, but it came out of money he didn't have to spare. He had to move the truck to a different location, one with less foot traffic, and start over building whatever thin recognition he'd managed to create in those first few days. He fixed the permit issue, pulled the right paperwork, and paid the fine in 2 installments. It cost him a week of momentum and a significant portion of the cash he'd made so far. The mechanical problems came in waves. The grill's igniter started misfiring, which meant he had to light the burners manually every morning with a long match, which wasn't dangerous so much as time-consuming and annoying. The refrigeration unit, which had seemed reliable after his repairs, began cycling off during the hottest part of the afternoon. He solved that by keeping a cooler with ice, as backup, restocking it every day from a convenience store 2 blocks from wherever he was parked. Every solution created a new small cost, and the small costs added up in ways that kept him permanently close to the edge. He learned to operate with almost nothing in reserve, and to treat every day as its own separate problem to solve. What made it harder was the visibility. A food truck on a quiet street is hard enough. A battered charcoal gray food truck with handwritten signage and a driver who looked like he'd been running on 4 hours of sleep was an easy thing for people to dismiss. Some customers would approach, read the menu, glance at the truck itself, and leave without ordering. He caught the looks, not cruel, just honest. The truck looked like what it was, a salvage job held together by determination and duct tape. First impressions in the food business were brutal, and his wasn't good. Rachel saw him during the second week. She was driving through that part of the city on her way to a meeting, and she spotted the truck parked along a commercial block with his small sandwich board sign set up on the sidewalk. She slowed down enough to confirm it was him. Marcus was at the window handling an order, his back half turned. She didn't stop. She kept driving, but she thought about it for the rest of the morning, not with any particular feeling of satisfaction, just a blunt recognition. This was what she'd expected. A man who couldn't fight for himself in a courtroom was going to end up doing something like this, selling food from a broken truck on a street where no one was looking. She felt no guilt about thinking it. It simply seemed true. Marcus knew none of this. He was too busy to think about Rachel or what anyone thought of him. He had the location problem, a mechanical problem, and a money problem, and they all required his attention at the same time. He moved the truck every few days, trying different blocks, different times of day, mapping foot traffic in his head. He started getting up before 5 in the morning to do prep work in the truck before the neighborhood woke up, and he stayed out until the evening crowd thinned. He was exhausted in a way that was different from the tiredness of working double shifts at Carver's. That had been physical. This was everything at once, body-mind, and something he didn't have a clean word for, the part of a person that keeps score of how things are going and reports back at 3 in the morning. The video happened on a Thursday evening in his 4th week. Marcus had been parked near the edge of a park, trying to catch the dinner crowd from a nearby apartment complex. Business had been slow. He'd sold maybe a dozen burgers over the course of 3 hours. With about 30 minutes until he planned to close up, a small group of people approached the window. Among them was a man he recognized as someone he'd seen sleeping rough near that part of the park, older, in a heavy coat despite the weather, carrying a paper bag. Marcus had 2 burgers left on the grill, already made, nothing to do with them, but wrapped them up for the trash. He gave them away. He didn't make a production of it. He wrapped the burgers, handed them through the window, and asked if the man wanted anything to drink. He had 2 bottles of water left over from the day's stock. He gave those away, too. He wasn't performing generosity, he just didn't want the food to go to waste, and didn't see a reason to let it. A woman standing a few feet away had her phone out, and had been recording something on the street. She caught the exchange without intending to make anything of it. She posted the short clip that night with a brief caption about watching a food truck owner give away his last burgers to someone who needed them, and about how good those burgers apparently smelled. By Friday morning, the clip had been shared several thousand times. By Saturday, it had reached a level of circulation that brought people specifically to find the truck. They came not just out of curiosity, but because something in the video had hit the right nerve. There was no performance in it, no awareness of the camera, just a man handing food through a window without making the other person feel small for receiving it. People responded to that. And then they tasted the burger. The burger was the thing Marcus had been building in his head for years, a specific combination that he'd never been able to put on anyone else's menu. The patty was thick, but not overworked, with a char on the outside that gave way to something still juicy in the center. The sauce had a tartness that cut through the fat without overwhelming it. The whole thing had a balance that was hard to describe, but easy to recognize. It tasted like someone who understood food had made it with real intention. Word of that started spreading separately from the video, and then the 2 streams of attention merged. The line at his window went from 3 or 4 people to 20, then 30. He sold out 2 days in a row, and had to turn people away. He added a second location day parking in a different neighborhood on alternate days to reach more customers. He started buying better ingredients because he could finally afford to, and the food got even better. He hired a part-time helper to handle the window on busy evenings while he worked the grill. For the first time since he bought the truck, he was making enough to cover his costs and put something aside. It wasn't stability yet, but it was visible from here. He allowed himself cautiously to believe it might actually work. Rachel heard about the video from a colleague who sent her the clip with a short message asking if that was her ex-husband. She watched it once. Then she did something she hadn't done since the divorce. She looked Marcus up. She found the coverage that local food bloggers had started writing, found his location schedule posted on a simple social media page he'd set up, and found that the truck now had a name, Hales. Simple, straightforward his. She sat with that information for a day before she made a call. The man she called was a business contact named Dennis Pruitt, a regional director for a hospitality group that had been looking to acquire local food brands with built-in audiences. Rachel had worked with Dennis on a commercial real estate deal 2 years earlier and stayed in touch. She told him about the truck, about the video, about the following Marcus had built. She presented it practically, an undercapitalized owner with a proven product and no infrastructure. Exactly the kind of acquisition that a larger group could absorb and scale profitably. Dennis was interested. He asked Rachel to set up a meeting. She reached out to Marcus directly. He didn't expect to hear from her, and when she called, he answered because he didn't recognize the number. She kept it professional, told him she knew people who were interested in buying into his brand, that she was trying to help him avoid wasting a good opportunity on a business he couldn't grow on his own. Marcus listened without saying much. He asked who the buyer was. She named the group. He was quiet for a moment, and then told her he wasn't interested in selling anything. Rachel told him he was making a mistake and that the offer wouldn't stay on the table. Marcus said he understood and ended the call. He went back to work. But the call had shifted something. He knew now that Rachel had been watching, that she'd seen enough to want a piece of it, and that she wouldn't take the refusal as a final answer. He was right about that. Within 2 weeks, the pressure started arriving in forms that were harder to trace. A health inspector appeared at his truck on a Tuesday morning, not a scheduled inspection, an unannounced visit that lasted 90 minutes and flagged 3 items that Marcus had never been cited for before. The violations were minor and correctable, but the inspection itself generated paperwork that created a delay in his permit renewal. 2 locations where he'd been parking regularly, a spot near a business park and a stretch near a weekend market, suddenly became unavailable. The property managers at both sites cited lease restrictions, but neither had mentioned any restrictions before. Marcus filed the paperwork, corrected the violations, and found new spots. He didn't have proof of anything. He just knew how things felt. The engine fire happened on a Wednesday night in November. Marcus was parked on the edge of a downtown block, wrapping up a slow evening when he smelled something burning from behind the cab. He shut everything down and got out fast. The electrical fire had started near the engine block, probably a wiring issue he'd been aware of, but hadn't had the money to address properly. By the time a passerby helped him put it out with a fire extinguisher, the damage was done. The engine was wrecked. The truck wasn't going anywhere. He sat on the curb in the rain for a long time that night. The truck was dark behind him, smelling of smoke and wet metal. He had 3 weeks of savings, left a broken engine, and a set of locations he'd fought to establish that would evaporate the moment he stopped showing up. Everything he'd built over the past several months felt suddenly thin, a structure made of good intentions and borrowed time, and it had just taken a hit that it might not survive. He thought about Terry looking at him the morning he handed over $300, that long, skeptical look that said this was already over before it began. He thought about Rachel's voice on the phone, calm and certain, "You can't grow this on your own." He sat in the rain, and for the first time, genuinely considered whether they had both been right. He started making calls the next day about engine repair costs. The numbers were bad. A full engine replacement on a truck, That old would run between $4,000 and $6,000, depending on the parts, far more than he had, and too much to recoup quickly enough to keep his customer base intact. He applied for a small business loan and was told the process would take 6 to 8 weeks. He didn't have 6 to 8 weeks. The locations would be gone. The momentum from the video had slowed anyway, and without consistent presence, whatever recognition he'd built would fade. He knew how quickly food audiences moved on. You had to be there. Every day you weren't, someone else was. A former colleague told him about the Westfield Food Festival, a large annual event held downtown, one of the biggest food gatherings in the region, drawing tens of thousands of attendees over a single weekend. Vendors who performed well there routinely used it as a launching point. It was exactly the kind of concentrated exposure that could reset everything for Marcus one weekend, that could generate enough revenue and attention to justify a real loan application, attract a legitimate investor, and give him the runway he needed. Registration was already closed, but there was a wait list for vendors who could demonstrate they had a following. Marcus applied, immediately submitted his social media numbers, the press coverage, everything he had. 3 days later, he got a confirmation email. He was in. He took the last of his savings and put it toward getting the engine repaired. Not perfectly, but well enough to run. He had one shot left, and it was 2 weeks away. The email arrived 2 days before the festival. It came from the event organizer's office, formal and brief, stating that his vendor registration had been flagged for review due to outstanding permit discrepancies on file with the city, and that his spot had been reassigned pending resolution. There was a contact number at the bottom. Marcus called it 4 times over the course of that afternoon. The first 3 times, no one answered. The 4th time, a woman picked up, read from what sounded like a prepared statement, and told him the decision had been made at the administrative level and was not subject to appeal before the event date. He asked what specific permit discrepancies were on file. She told him she didn't have that information available. He thanked her and ended the call. He drove to the city permit office the next morning and waited in line for 2 hours. When he finally reached the counter, the clerk pulled up his file and told him that the discrepancies cited were related to the violations from the health inspection 2 months earlier, the same violations he had already corrected and documented and submitted paperwork on. Those corrections were in the system. The file should have been closed. The clerk couldn't explain why it hadn't been. She offered to submit a correction request, which would be processed in 5 to 7 business days. The festival was in 48 hours. Marcus stood at the counter for a moment, looked at the clerk, thanked her, and walked back out into the street. He sat in the truck in the permit office parking lot for a long time. The engine idled unevenly. The repair had been adequate, but not complete, and he could feel the slight roughness every time it turned over. He had put his last savings into that repair. He had no festival spot, no backup plan, and nowhere left to appeal. He thought about calling someone, but there was no one to call. There was no attorney, no business partner, no one whose job it was to help him navigate this. He was, as he had been from the beginning, entirely alone in this. He thought about selling the truck. It was the rational move. A working food truck, even a damaged and repaired one, had resale value, probably not much, but enough to cover his rent for a few months, while he figured out what came next. He could go back to kitchen work. He still had his skills, still had his experience. Someone would hire him. He could work someone else's line, manage someone else's kitchen, build someone else's reputation for a salary that would keep him housed and fed. It was a reasonable life. It was the life he'd had before, more or less, and he'd survived it. There was no shame in going back to it. But he stayed in the parking lot, engine running, and didn't drive to any buyer. Instead, he found himself thinking about the morning he'd handed Terry $300 for a truck that most people would have paid to have removed. He thought about the first night he'd cleaned the grill alone, scraping years of build-up off by hand in a cold garage. He thought about the permit citation, the engine fire, the rain, the location managers who'd suddenly discovered restrictions they'd never mentioned before. He thought about Rachel's voice on the phone, even, and certain, telling him the offer wouldn't stay on the table, as though the best thing Marcus could hope for was to let someone else absorb what he'd built before it collapsed on its own. He thought about all of it, and then he thought about what it would mean to call her right. He thought about what it would mean to get back on the road tomorrow and keep working, not to prove something to Rachel, not to prove something to anyone who had looked at him the wrong way, but simply because he had built something real and it was worth keeping. That was the thing that had gotten lost somewhere in the past few months. He'd started measuring his own effort against Rachel's expectations, against the skeptics, against the people who'd looked at the truck and walked away. He'd been fighting to prove them wrong, but the food was never about them. The burger he'd built in his head for years, the one he finally got to make on his own terms, that existed before Rachel said anything, before the divorce, before all of it. It was his, and letting it die in a parking lot because someone pulled the right administrative lever was not something he was willing to do. He put the truck in drive and headed toward the festival grounds. The Westfield Food Festival occupied 6 city blocks in the downtown core. By the time Marcus arrived, the vendor area inside the perimeter was already sealed off, barriers up, event staff at every entry point. No unauthorized vehicles allowed past the checkpoint. He drove the perimeter slowly, looking at the layout. The inside of the festival was packed. He could see crowds moving between vendor stalls, could hear music from somewhere near the center. He kept driving. On the far eastern edge of the festival footprint, where the barrier ended and the regular street began, there was a stretch of public sidewalk running alongside a small plaza. No barriers, no event staff, open to anyone. He pulled the truck up to the curb, set up his sandwich board on the sidewalk, and opened the window. The first people who approached were simply curious. They'd been walking toward the festival entrance and noticed the truck parked just outside the perimeter. A few of them recognized the name from the video. One of them ordered a burger and ate it, standing at the curb while people streamed past. He told 2 people near him that it was worth stopping for. Those 2 people stopped. Word moved the way it moves in a crowd when something is happening right now. Not through a phone screen, but through direct contact. One person turning to another and saying, "You should try this." Within 40 minutes, the line stretched back along the sidewalk and around the corner of the plaza. Marcus worked the grill without stopping, moving through his prep, with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this in a tiny space for months and knew every square inch of it. He ran out of his initial stock and called his supplier for an emergency delivery. The supplier sent a driver with more patties and produce within the hour. Marcus kept going. A man named Greg Sloan had been at the festival representing a regional restaurant investment group that made a practice of attending food events specifically to find operators worth backing. He had already walked the full vendor floor inside the festival and hadn't seen anything that surprised him. On his way back to his car, he passed the line on the sidewalk outside the perimeter. He joined it partly out of curiosity, and partly because the line itself was the data point that many people standing on a public sidewalk outside an event they could have gone into meant something was pulling them there specifically. He ordered a burger. He ate it. He stood there for a moment and then got back in line and ordered another one. Then he asked the man at the window if he had a business card. Marcus didn't have a business card. He wrote his number on a napkin with a marker and handed it through the window. Greg Sloan folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. The call came the following Monday morning. Greg introduced himself, explained what his group did, and told Marcus directly that he wanted to have a serious conversation about investment. Not acquisition, he was specific about that distinction. He wasn't interested in buying the brand and absorbing it into something else. He was interested in providing capital for Marcus to scale on his own terms with proper infrastructure in exchange for a minority stake in the business. He'd looked at the video, the press coverage, the numbers from the festival day. He said what he'd observed was an operator who understood both the food and the customer in a way that couldn't be manufactured or transferred. He wanted to back that, not replace it. Marcus asked for a week to think. Greg said that was fine and gave him his office number. Marcus spent that week doing something he hadn't allowed himself to do since the day he bought the truck. He thought about what he actually wanted. Not what was survivable, not what was realistic given his situation, but what he was actually trying to build. He wrote it out on a notepad in his room. Not a business plan, just a list of principles. The food would not change. The sourcing would not be compromised to cut costs. Every location would have the same standard as the truck. Not better looking, but lazier in the kitchen. The truck itself would stay. He didn't have a clean reason for that last point, but it felt important in a way he didn't want to argue himself out of. He called Greg back at the end of the week and said he was interested. He had conditions. Greg told him to bring them to the meeting. The meeting took 3 hours. Marcus came with his notepad and his numbers, and the clear, unhurried manner of someone who had already decided what he would and wouldn't accept. Greg brought a lawyer and a term sheet. They went through it line by line. Marcus pushed back on 2 clauses, one related to menu approval rights, one related to the timeline for opening the first permanent location. Greg accepted both changes without much negotiation. When Marcus walked out of that office, he had a signed agreement and a capital commitment large enough to open 3 locations within 18 months. The first permanent Hales opened 8 months later in a converted retail space downtown. The second followed 4 months after that in a neighborhood on the north side of the city. The third was under construction by the end of the first year. Each location kept the same menu, the same sourcing standards, the same quality Marcus had maintained in the truck. The food press covered the expansion. A regional television segment ran a short piece on the story, the $300, the broken truck, the festival sidewalk. That segment got picked up by a national food media outlet, and then by a broader news wire. The name Hales stopped being a local thing and started being a story that traveled. Marcus gave interviews carefully without embellishment, describing what had happened in plain terms. He didn't make it dramatic. He just told the truth, and the truth turned out to be dramatic enough on its own. He kept the truck. It sat in the parking lot behind the first permanent location, no longer operational, but cleaned up and preserved the charcoal gray paint, touched up the serving window polished. Some of the staff who came to work for the company knew the story behind it. Some didn't. Marcus didn't make a point of explaining it to everyone. It was enough that it was there. 2 years after the festival, Marcus was invited to appear on a national program that featured entrepreneurs who had built businesses from unconventional starting points. The segment was filmed over 2 days. They shot footage of the original truck of the first location on a busy lunch service of Marcus, working the grill the same way he always had. Head down, focused, no performance. The interviewer asked him at one point whether he ever thought about what it would have been like if someone had stepped in earlier, if he'd had capital from the start, instead of having to fight for every inch of it. Marcus said he'd thought about it. Then he said that he wasn't sure the business would have been the same if it had been easier to build, because the constraints had forced him to understand every part of it in a way that couldn't be taught. He said it without bitterness, as a plain observation. The interviewer moved on. The cameras kept rolling. The night the segment aired nationally, Rachel was in her apartment, getting ready for bed, when she turned the television on for background noise. She wasn't paying attention to what was on. She was moving through her routine, thinking about the next day when she heard the name. She turned toward the screen. Marcus was standing in the first Hales location, talking to the interviewer, in a way that was completely unhurried, completely at ease. Behind him, through the restaurant's large front window, there was a line of people waiting to get in. The chyron at the bottom of the screen identified him as the founder of a restaurant group, with 11 locations currently in operation and a 12th under development. Rachel watched the rest of the segment without moving. When it ended, she sat down on the edge of the couch and stayed there in the quiet of her apartment. She thought about the phone call, where she'd told him the offer wouldn't stay on the table. She thought about driving past the truck that second week and filing it away as confirmation of what she'd already decided about him. She thought about the permit paperwork and the health inspection and the festival registration, and she didn't let herself pretend she didn't know how those things had unfolded. She sat with all of it in the silence of the room. There was no version of this where she had been right about him. The man she had looked at and seen a ceiling had gone somewhere she hadn't imagined, and built something that was by any honest measure real. The truck in the parking lot behind his first location, preserved deliberate, unmistakably has told you everything about what kind of person had built this. Not someone who forgot where they started. Not someone who needed to erase the hard part to feel good about where they ended up. Someone who kept the broken thing as a reminder that the broken thing was where it began. Rachel sat alone in her apartment, the television still on, and there was nothing left for her to say about any of it.